Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't just break ceasefires, he builds them to break. Each one seems to be drafted like a booby trap before he'll assent to it. Moral language on the outside, political detonation wired to blow underneath. This latest truce in Gaza is no exception because within hours of signing off on it, Netanyahu is already back to redefining its terms, now demanding Hamas fully disarm before Israel fully withdraws from Gaza, the diplomatic equivalent of demanding surrender before peace. In point of fact, he's making a demand set to be part of phase 2 of the ceasefire talks, but demanding Hamas do this as part of phase 1. Hamas, on the other hand, are simply demanding Netanyahu stick to what he signed off on now, stick to what they have signed off on, which in itself would make a change, wouldn't it? The people of Gaza, Hamas and non-Hamas alike, have seen this performance from Netanyahu too many times to mistake it for peace. They know how fragile the current situation is. But in Netanyahu's playbook, every ceasefire is a press release with a timer attached, and when it explodes, he'll call it acting in self-defense yet again. He thinks he's found a way out of this ceasefire, so we need to call it out and tell him, we can see what you're up to. Right, so the ceasefire that has now taken effect in Gaza, aside from ongoing Israeli strikes, which are becoming fewer at least, shows what a fragile peace we actually have right now. And of course, we know it's fragile. We've seen how they played out previously. Western broadcasters speak of calm returning to the Strip, of families heading north, of aid trucks edging through checkpoints. The phrase, the truce is holding, is a welcome phrase to hear, but also it's a nod to how easily things could go back the other way as well, all whilst also not actually saying everything that really should be being said. In reality, Gaza is a ruin. United Nations field teams report that roughly 70% of northern housing stock is destroyed or uninhabitable. So all those people we're told are returning to their homes, they're actually returning to where their homes once stood, because they actually have no home to return to. About 1.8 million people, 85% of the population, remain displaced. The returns so often described are little more than pilgrimages to rubble. They're not reclaiming their homes, they are locating what is left of them, what is left where they once stood. Even under ceasefire, Gaza's health ministry recorded 19 Palestinians killed within the last 24 hours. Western outlets neither confirmed nor denied that, they simply omitted to talk about it. And that silence is what keeps the fiction alive that quiet equals peace. For those still living amid the dust, the difference, frankly, right now is largely academic still. Benjamin Netanyahu's career is built on a rhythm of escalation and pause. Every ceasefire he has ever endorsed follows the same choreography. Sign under pressure, obstruct in practice, invent a breach, resume bombardment. In 2014, after Operation Protective Edge, Israel agreed to an Egyptian brokered truce promising reconstruction and limited lifting of the blockade. Within weeks, Netanyahu declared Hamas's failure to disarm as a violation, a clause that never actually existed in the agreement at all. In 2021, following Operation Guardian of the Walls, he told Israelis that quiet will be met with quiet. Yet within 3 weeks, airstrikes resumed on the grounds that Hamas was testing rockets. In 2023, when humanitarian pauses allowed hostage exchanges, Netanyahu told Parliament that the war would resume until Hamas is eliminated. Each pause recast as an intermission before the next act unfolds. Across a decade, no ceasefire he has signed has ever reached completion. It's his method. His track record on ceasefires confirms his word on such things is worthless. The 2025 agreement that we're looking at now, drafted by the United States with Qatar and Egypt, divides it into 2 phases. Phase 1 covers the cessation of hostilities, hostage and prisoner exchanges, partial withdrawal of Israeli troops, and unhindered humanitarian entry. Phase 2 concerns reconstruction, the creation of a unified Palestinian administration, and the eventual disarmament of resistance groups. From that, you can tell Phase 2 is going to take a period of time. Even Trump's own 20-point plan sets this order out clearly. Disarmament follows the return of hostages and the offer of amnesty. Clause 6 of it specifies that only those Hamas members who decommission weapons after that stage receive safe passage or integration into a legitimate security structure. Hours after signing, though, Netanyahu announced that Hamas must disarm the easy way or the hard way. By promoting a second phase condition into the first, he's already effectively voided the deal, whilst appearing to still honour it. This is his playbook. This is clearly how he thinks he can blow this ceasefire up now. That inversion and his confidence in repeating it is the mechanism by which every Israeli ceasefire ends up falling apart. Hamas have responded to this publicly and unambiguously, though. A senior official has said that handing over weapons was out of the question and not negotiable. Another representative stated that the organisation would only disarm if its fighters were incorporated into a Palestinian national army under a Palestinian sovereign state. Whatever you think of Hamas, that formulation echoes the American plan's second phase design. Hamas's position is therefore not a rejection of peace, but a defence of the sequencing as laid out, as signed up to. First withdrawal, then political settlement, then disarmament under Palestinian sovereignty. Palestinian factions have since reaffirmed that Gaza's future government will be determined internally, not by foreign administrators. And if we acknowledge the existence of a Palestinian state now, as many of us do, as increasing numbers of countries in recent weeks now have, surely they have that right to self-determination, to decide who leads them and what kind of government they have, predicated on Hamas ceding power, of course, which they have for some time now accepted as a requirement of this. International law supports the logic behind this. No occupied population is obliged to disarm while an occupying force remains in place. That's mad. That's insane. Who would ever agree to that if they were put in their shoes? Doing so would amount to surrender under coercion, and it would nullify the right to self-defense. They'd be surrendering that, which is guaranteed to them by the UN Charter. Netanyahu's demand for immediate disarmament, therefore, was never about enforcing security. It's about creating grounds for accusation, and we know what follows from that. His political history shows a recurring use of linguistic loopholes to justify escalation. In 2024, and again since 2023, it has been Hamas tunnels. In 2021, it was balloons he came up with. He literally accused Hamas of targeting Israeli jets with incendiary balloons. And in 2023, it's also been the use of the tactical pause. Each narrative begins with a claim of Hamas non-compliance and then ends with the next bombardment, all conveniently before the right wing of his coalition government collapses said government. And Western media dutifully carries on that narrative. But what makes this pattern harder to disguise now is the physical evidence emerging from Gaza's ruins. As residents return to what used to be Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution centres, remember those, they are finding US and Israeli manufactured ammunition scattered among the debris. These are the same sites where months earlier civilians queuing for food were shot at by Israeli forces and American security contractors, and it was all vehemently denied at the time. Hamas were blamed for it. Well, how did Hamas get US and Israeli munitions then? Seems a fair question to ask at the very least, doesn't it? Human Rights Watch has classified those killings as war crimes. Multiple whistleblowers describe the use of live rounds and stun grenades against starving civilians desperate for food. The spent cartridges now being recovered corroborate those testimonies and give the first concrete proof that the humanitarian zones were militarized from the start. This discovery intensifies the pressure on Netanyahu's narrative, though. The aid infrastructure his government hailed as proof of moral restraint now stands as material evidence of criminal conduct. It transforms an allegation into a record, one the ICC and the ICJ will, I'm sure, gladly accept into their evidence folders. Television coverage of Gaza's reopening is focused on the sight of families walking north through rubble-strewn streets. Captions call it a homecoming. In truth, they're visiting the graveyards of what formerly stood there. Infrastructure is gone. Roads are impassable. Their homes are gone. Their entire lives have been reduced to piles of rubble. Field assessments by the UN confirm that the material capacity for habitation there has collapsed. Those returning do so because displacement camps have become unlivable. Food scarcity remains acute. Water is unsafe. Hospitals function at minimal levels. Aid might be queuing up to get in now, but they need shed loads of it, and fast. UN experts warn that full recovery is going to take generations now, calling the scale of destruction a continuation of the 1948 Nakba. The description fits. It's not an exaggeration in the slightest. The demographic pattern of families displaced from the same districts as their ancestors were turns history into repetition by design. As Gaza still reels from that fallout, though, Western officials have decided to float the idea of installing Tony Blair in, haven't they, to oversee reconstruction and governance reform of all people. And the reaction from Palestinian factions has been an obvious one, frankly, I would imagine. It's been unanimous rejection of such an idea. Blair's record in Iraq and his perceived bias during his previous envoy role, where it was all about his own business interests and how to make money at the same time, makes his return politically untenable. Besides, what right does another Western figure have anyway, especially one as blood-stained as Blair, to rule over Palestine? Palestinian leaders have stated that Gaza's administration would remain a Palestinian matter. That now surely must be inarguable. Every foreign supervisory project in the past, from the Oslo framework to the Quartet's oversight, has entrenched Israeli control rather than limited it. We recognise a Palestinian state now, don't we? What right have we got, any of us, to try and impose anyone, least of all Blair? Blair's proposed appointment looks more like another attempt to just outsource further occupation. So that rejection becomes another pillar of internal unity, contradicting the Western narrative of perpetual Palestinian division. Western news language continues to perform the same sanitizing role it has throughout the conflict as well. Israeli strikes are called operations, not attacks, and civilian deaths become fatalities, and ceasefire violations are just responses. Each is a euphemism, and each one of those euphemisms reduces accountability and equalizes the aggressor and the victim. This linguistic neutralization sustains Netanyahu's strategy as well. It portrays his manipulations as ambiguities rather than lies. By the time investigations confirm what happened, the political window for outrage ends up closing. The control of language functions as an extension of the ceasefire's architecture, flexible for Israel, binding for Gaza. Inside Israel, maintaining conflict is politically profitable. Netanyahu's coalition, of course, relies on far-right partners, as we know, the parties of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, whose electoral base equates compromise with weakness, and the total end to hostilities as utterly unacceptable. When violence pauses, internal dissent grows. We know this is going on behind the scenes. And other issues like Netanyahu's corruption case start to regain more attention. Renewed fighting ends up suppressing both of those issues for Netanyahu. Recent polling shows Netanyahu's approval ratings happen to rise each time he adopts a hardline stance. There's a reflection of Israeli society for you. Though that said, his ratings are not that great right now, as genocide fatigue is very much set in. And that feedback loop, though, means that the longer peace holds, the greater the domestic risk is to his leadership. We know he can't sustain it going forwards and stay in power. The personal and political incentives to escalate again, blaming it all on Hamas, align perfectly, therefore. We should all know by now, above all else, that for Netanyahu, peace is not a goal, it's a liability to him. International legal norms require that treaties be implemented in good faith, yet by signing an agreement and immediately trying to alter its sequence, Israel breaches that principle, just as they've done each and every time before. United Nations rapporteurs have repeatedly cited its record of non-compliance with humanitarian commitments, from blocking aid convoys to targeting medical facilities. When viewed together with the newly uncovered munitions evidence, for example, these actions begin to form an even larger pattern of negotiation used as camouflage for continued occupation. The ceasefire becomes a part of a legal instrument for preserving the very conditions it claims to want to end. The numbers alone tell the story as well, if we break it down into such matters. Nearly 2 million displaced, 70% of northern housing destroyed, chronic famine indicators confirmed by international monitors. Even if restrictions are lifted immediately, rebuilding just even basic infrastructure is going to take decades. These facts describe not recovery, but controlled deprivation now, that's going to last for a considerable period of time. Israel retains authority over border crossings, determines which materials may enter. The occupation itself hasn't ended, and it will use those levers to manage political outcomes. Humanitarian access has therefore just become another arm of policy. Every delay or denial functions as coercion, further coercion. And Netanyahu's narrative rests on moral inversion as well. Hamas's insistence on retaining arms until occupation ends is portrayed as rejectionism. Israel's refusal to withdraw is described as prudence on their part. And this reversal, which is aped in the media, allows the occupying power to claim virtue while enforcing subjugation. Never mind the fact it runs counter to the order of the peace plan itself that both parties have signed up to. So every ceasefire ends with the same accusation: Hamas acting in bad faith. Each accusation conceals Israel's own violations at the same time, though. And the pattern ends up being institutionalized by the mainstream media to the point of predictability, and I very much doubt I'm the only one thinking in such terms, if you're still watching by this point of the video. The ceasefire is going to have to last more than a few weeks for me to start thinking otherwise. The destruction of Gaza's infrastructure and the forced movement of its population amount to a demographic transformation that does echo the events of 1948. International experts, apart some of whom I've already alluded to, have regarded it as a continuation of the Nakba. Others have termed it a second Nakba, which captures the same continuity. The argument's not rhetorical. There is evidence for it. Systematic displacement, destruction of housing, the obstruction of return meet established legal criteria for the deliberate infliction of destructive living conditions. And in this framework, the ceasefire is thus a transition, therefore, to peace, that a pause in an ongoing process of removal. The United States remains both architect and guarantor of this ceasefire. It drafted the framework. It armed one side of this genocide. One of the parties continues to support that one party. And it continues to define what counts as compliance as well. US soldiers are now in place to oversee it, but from whose point of view are they going to be acting? The dual role makes accountability questionable at the very least, doesn't it? For Israel and for Netanyahu, perpetual war becomes a psychological and political necessity. It keeps the electorate mobilised and the opposition marginalised and the international community perpetually reacting rather than restraining. Western agencies function as global gatekeepers of verification, while regional outlets, those closest to the events, are treated as secondary. When Palestinian sources report casualties, the phrase unverified too often accompanies them. Israeli claims seldom receive that same qualifier, do they? So this hierarchy delays recognition of violations and allows official narratives to end up settling in their place. The GHF killings were first reported by local journalists weeks before Western sources even looked at them. And even when they did, they took Israeli talking points as fact. By the time those reports were accepted, political focus had shifted again. The finding of this ammunition on those sites now ought to refocus that and bring it back into the present, but as far as mainstream media goes, I very much doubt it will. Yet after 2 years of this now, the Israeli use of deception is fully visible and in more of our minds. Netanyahu's government signs agreements under external pressure, it manipulates the clauses, it provokes breaches, it resumes war while blaming the other side. Each stage is predictable. We can see it coming now, can't we? This ceasefire is already following the same patterns I'm sure others apart from myself have identified. By demanding disarmament during Phase 1, Netanyahu ensures that Hamas's refusal can later be used as justification for renewed assault, because Western mainstream media will carry his perspective. The pretext is built into the blueprint, so therefore this is not failure of diplomacy so much as domination by design. For the first time, however, regardless of that media framing, the evidentiary balance is shifting, and that matters from the legal standpoint, even if it doesn't cut through in the media. The munitions recovered from those aid sites, the contradictions between Netanyahu's statements and the American plan which he signed, and the mounting documentation from humanitarian agencies all now constitute a record of deceit that Israel and Netanyahu will not be able to evade. International lawyers and investigative journalists, the proper ones, are assembling a paper trail that connects battlefield practice to political instruction. The very language Netanyahu used to justify control, those of disarmament and security and oversight, is being repurposed as evidence of premeditated manipulation. The pretext machine has started to feed back on its maker, therefore, not before time. If this documentation continues to accumulate, Netanyahu may face the first genuine political cost of his ongoing ceasefire strategy. The walls are closing in as the evidence mounts, so to speak. If this ceasefire breaks down, as I cannot escape the gut feeling it's going to at some point, whether imminently or gradually, it will confirm more than the failure of one negotiation, though. It will expose a collapse of the diplomatic order. When a signatory can alter terms the moment they are signed and get away with blaming the other side for it, as has happened too many times before, for people to accept that as the truth, then what passes for rules-based order loses all meaning. For Palestinians, the lesson is grimly familiar. Justice depends on politics, not law. For their sake, I hope I am wrong this time, and this peace is going to hold. But for the international community, it poses a broader question, whether any peace process led by the same actors that armed the war, that collapsed the ceasefires of before, can ever be legitimate and can ever work, and if it doesn't, what needs to change? From my mind, I can't see this ever coming to pass and ever happening for as long as Netanyahu is in charge. Netanyahu's ceasefires are not routes to peace. They never work out that way. They always lead back to war. The evidence now available, the official documents, the public statements, the material proof now being found, demonstrates intent. He signs under pressure from the US, shifts definitions, provokes refusal, and restarts the violence. And the US backs that. The pattern's deliberate, it's not accidental. Every fact supports that conclusion. The two-phase plan, Hamas's documented compliance with its sequence, the killings during the truce already, the militarized aid zones, the absence of condemnation from allies. Together they reveal a system in which deceit is the governance. The ceasefire is already being defined by the fragments of ammunition found and whose it was, the broken aid depots and the clauses Netanyahu is trying to twist to bring it all down again. He's built a political architecture in which truth is expendable and peace is conditional, but every lie ends up leaving a mark, and those marks are now measurable in the satellite imagery we've seen, in the forensic debris being found, and in the diplomatic archives of the very governments that shield him. until his day of reckoning arrives, and he has to have one. Every ceasefire signed under his hand will almost certainly carry the same hidden expiry date, a promise written only to be broken at some point in the near future and blamed on someone else. There's still reasons, however, to think this ceasefire could be Netanyahu's undoing, regardless of what he does, though. So many of us are onto him now, not to mention those in Israel, after all, regardless of mainstream media narratives. So if you'd like a somewhat cheerier look at how this might actually end up being Netanyahu's undoing, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, as I did a bit of a deep dive into that. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.